はい。これですね。 So sorry to waiting us. It is a technical program which was so please very talented. Thank you so much.
いいですか？ OK です。はい、お願いします。はい、どうぞ。
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. Today we have invited Jeffrey Sachs, world-renowned excellent professor, to give a speech online in special conference room under the House of Councillors building, entitled "The Peace in Ukraine and Gaza War and in Asia." This is Chair Kumiko, distinguished professor at the Josai International University and Aoyama University. Jeffrey Sachs is a professor at Columbia University and a world-renowned economist who has worked on climate change, financial crisis, national economic reform, poverty resolution, and SDGs, together with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. In recent years, he has been initiative talking and speaking out about the peace in the Russia-Ukrainian war and the Israel-Gaza war and peacemaking in Asia. Recently, he gave a wonderful speech at the European Parliament. We are grateful to invite Professor Jeffrey Sachs to have a speech for Japanese people and parliament representatives. Now, dear Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Haba. Thank you for arranging this talk. And ladies and gentlemen that are listening, it's a privilege to be with you. I look forward to the chance to exchange ideas and to explain to you my perspective on what is happening in the world today and what is the correct approach to diplomacy and peacemaking. This is very relevant for Japan because Japan is, of course, not only one of the world's most important leading countries, but faces many questions about the role of the United States, the role of China, the role of Russia, and the path to security. My main message is that security can be achieved only through diplomacy, not through great power, politics, or confrontation. confrontation. The idea of security through a military buildup in Japan, to my mind, is a mistake. What I believe to be important in East Asia, as in the other crises that I will discuss, is diplomacy. I see no barrier to peaceful cooperation between China, Japan, Korea, and the other countries of the Asia-Pacific region. So I do not believe that the issue is Japan's security against China, for example. I believe that China and Japan can get along peacefully, as they have done through most of their history over the last 2,000 years. The record is largely one of peace, and the question is how to ensure peace looking forward. And I believe that U.S. military bases and military approaches are not the answer to that, but diplomacy, shared values, shared objectives are the answer. So I've been kindly asked by Professor羽場to speak about three different global crises, the one in Ukraine, the one in the Middle East, and the one in East Asia. And you'll see from my remarks that I believe they have a common root, and the common root is great power politics, especially U.S. politics, because the United States has been the dominant country in the world since 1945, and I believe that it has misused its dominance by focusing on military rather than diplomatic approaches, and that it's because of the failure of diplomacy that we have these tensions, including these conflicts. I have been personally involved in all three regions for more than 40 years. My first trip to Ukraine and to Russia was 55 years ago in 1970. After that, I served as an economic advisor to President Mikhail Gorbachev and to President Boris Yeltsin 35 years ago. I served as an economic advisor to the President of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, 30 years ago. So my experience is firsthand. My first trip to Israel was 53 years ago. I have been going to the Middle East for more than 50 years, and I believe that I understand a lot about that conflict as well. My first trip to Japan was 45 years ago, and I have had the great privilege to be coming to Japan for more than 45 years. And I'm a great admirer of Japan, and with many, many students and many colleagues in Japan over more than 4 decades. I have been going to China also for 44 years, since 1981. I come to Japan and to China usually at least once a year, but often many times a year, and also to Korea. So I believe that I have some firsthand knowledge of your wonderful region of the world, and I want to share my perspective on your region as well. Let me start back in 1945, at the end of World War II. At that point, the United States was the dominant country in the world. It was the only major economy in the world that had not been damaged or destroyed by the Second World War. So the United States was by far the technological leader of the world, and it was the industrial and military leader of the world. And for that reason, it created a great deal of the post-war world. Well, Japan knows the story well, because Japan was occupied by the United States for several years after 1945, and the United States helped Japan to rebuild after World War II. it was already in 1945, but especially by 1947, that the United States decided that the Soviet Union was the new enemy, and that even though the U.S. and the Soviet Union had been allies in World War II against the German Japanese axis, the two allies broke apart soon after the end of World War II and entered, of course, into the Cold War. During the Cold War, the United States was the dominant economy and the technological leader on most areas, but the Soviet Union was a very formidable country and a formidable military country. And the arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union was very aggressive, especially in nuclear armaments, and both sides built up tens of thousands of nuclear weapons during this period. There were moments when the Russian or the Soviet side was clearly ahead, the most notable being 1957 with the launch of Sputnik, when Soviet space technology was ahead of the United States space technology, and the Soviet Union succeeded in putting a satellite into orbit for the first time. And this, of course, led to the space race and the race to the moon, and also to the race of militarizing space. The point, however, is that the period from 1945 to 1989 was a period of confrontation, a very dangerous period of confrontation. In my opinion, which I won't elaborate because it would take us a little bit far afield, I believe that the United States was not interested in ending the Cold War, but rather in winning the Cold War. There were times when the Soviet Union proposed a solution to end the Cold War, the most important of which was the demilitarization of Germany and turning Germany into a neutral country rather than into a NATO country. The United States rejected that approach. The United States was against the neutrality of Germany and favored the rearmament of Germany as the major military power in Europe to fight with the Soviet Union if the Cold War turned into a hot war. So the United States did not pursue one avenue to end the Cold War in the 1940s and 50s, which was the demilitarization of Germany. Rather, the United States established NATO, and the idea of NATO was to build up a formidable military alliance that would confront the Soviet Union. And that is how the Cold War proceeded. Of course, during the Cold War, there were moments when the Cold War almost became a global nuclear war. And the most notable was October 1962, when the Soviet Union put in military bases and offensive nuclear weapons into Cuba. And this led to confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and very, very nearly to nuclear war. It was only because President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Chairman Nikita Khrushchev were more careful than their aides and their advisors that we did not end the world in October 1962. The two leaders found a way to resolve the crisis peacefully without war, but it was a very close call. Now, in 1989, the Soviet Union was by then in economic crisis, and the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which had been under the Soviet control, wanted their independence. And I participated in that process personally as a leading economic advisor to governments aimed to escape from the Soviet system and to rejoin the European Union market economy. I can tell you at that period, the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, favored those changes. It was very remarkable. He actually helped to bring about the democratization of Central and Eastern Europe because he was a man of peace, and he wanted to end the Cold War peacefully, and he wanted reform truly, and he wanted democratization truly. It was the great opportunity of our time. I saw it firsthand. I recommended at that time that the United States help the Soviet Union to make reforms. My ideas were rejected by the U.S. government. They said, why should we help our enemy? And I said, because the Soviet Union is not your enemy. The Soviet Union is trying to make changes. But the United States thinks in terms of friends and enemies. It cannot think in any other way. As an imperial power, the United States has its friends and it has its enemies. And the Soviet Union was an enemy. And the leadership of the United States was not flexible enough in its thinking to understand that the Soviet Union was no longer an enemy. So the United States government rejected my advice to give help to the Soviet Union. Gorbachev fell from power in 1991, and the Soviet Union ended in December 1991. I was in the Kremlin the day that happened, speaking with President Boris Yeltsin, and I assured him that the United States would help Russia to make its economic and political transformation. Once again, I was mistaken, because even after the end of the Soviet Union, the United States now viewed Russia as an enemy rather than taking the chance for peace with Russia. This was a grave mistake. This has led me to believe for more than 30 years that the United States does not have a sophisticated foreign policy. It understands the military approach, but it is a failure at the diplomatic approach. At the end of 1991, the United States saw the chance not only to now dominate the former Soviet Union, but even to break apart Russia. So there were ideas in the U.S. government that just as the Soviet Union had divided along ethnic lines, now Russia too would break apart because, according to the U.S. view, Russia was too large and it should be divided between a European part, a Central Asian part, and a Far Eastern part, and that Russia could be pushed to fall apart. That became the U.S. plan. Rather than cooperating with Russia, the idea was to weaken Russia. Now, just to say, in 1990, when this transformation was taking place, Germany reunited. And for Germany to reunite, that required an agreement among the occupying powers of Germany. Because technically speaking, Germany was an occupied country all the way until 1990, after World War II. And the occupying powers were the UK, France, the United States, and Soviet Union. So there needed to be a treaty of the four occupying powers to allow East and West Germany to unite. The Germans, of course, were very keen to unite. So they told President Gorbachev, if we unite, NATO will not take advantage. NATO will not move eastward. And this was very explicitly repeated to Gorbachev on many occasions. And there is much archival documentary proof of that. This is denied by the United States now. But the United States government lies repeatedly. They told Gorbachev no eastward expansion of NATO, specifically on the 7th of February, 1990. So did the German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher say exactly the same thing to Gorbachev. But the United States and Germany lied afterwards, and they began NATO enlargement after 1991. Now this is very important to understand. After 1991, the United States did not see the end of the Cold War as a triumph of peace, as an achievement of Gorbachev. The United States saw the end of the Cold War as a victory over the Soviet Union. So rather than declaring this a mutual win of the peoples of the United States and the former Soviet Union, the United States declared it a victory, saying that the Soviet Union lost and the United States won, and now the United States was the world's sole superpower and it could do what it wants to do. I believe that the period after 1991 was the greatest period of arrogance of American foreign policy in our history. Because after 1991, the United States' attitude was, the United States is the all-powerful country. There are no rivals. Russia is a third-rate country. China is a poor, rice-growing country. There was simply the idea that the United States was dominant. Remember, too, in that period, the United States took steps to actually hold back the Japanese economy as well. Because in the 1980s, there was the idea that Japan could overtake the United States in manufacturing. And the United States took very specific measures on the currency and on export controls and on other measures to prevent Japan's continued rapid progress. So the early 1990s not only saw the end of the Soviet Union and the rise of American arrogance, but also a deep crisis in Japan, the bursting of the financial bubble, so-called. But that wasn't really a bubble. The finance in Japan was based on the idea of continued rapid growth of the Japanese economy. But the United States put an end to that growth because it regarded Japanese automotive production, semiconductor production, and other industrial advances to be dangerous to the United States. By the mid-1990s, the United States was very satisfied with foreign policy. Everything was working. There was one superpower. Everything else was under control. China was regarded as a marginal economy. Russia was regarded as a third-rate power. Japan was regarded as a loyal subsidiary and not a threat to the United States. So the United States was dominant in all dimensions. So the United States felt. And the United States began on that basis to expand its military role around the world. This is very odd. There was no threat anymore. But the United States expanded the military reach. It didn't reduce the military reach. Why is that? Because the goal was not peace. The goal was dominance. And so just as peace had come, NATO began to expand eastward from Germany. In 1999, NATO expanded to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. In 2004, NATO expanded to 7 more countries: Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. In 2008, a decisive event occurred. At the NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania, the United States declared that NATO would move to Ukraine and to the country of Georgia in the Caucasus region. Now this was a direct provocation to Russia, because this would mean the presence of the U.S. military on Russia's borders, both in Russia's western border, which is 2,100 kilometers long with Ukraine, and in Russia's southern border, in the Caucasus region, which is a very unstable region of high vulnerability to Russia. United States said it would move NATO there. There was no defense reason to move NATO to Georgia, just the opposite. But the United States persevered despite Russian very, very strong objections, saying that the United States was provocative, that it was cheating on promises, threatening war, and so on. And do understand that in that context, the United States had also destabilized the nuclear arrangements because in 2002, the United States had left the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally. And that meant that from Russia's point of view, the nuclear arms framework had been compromised, NATO was expanding, and the United States was directly threatening Russia. And I can tell you, the U.S. foreign policy aimed to destabilize Russia. So Russia was not being paranoid, Russia was being realistic in understanding that the United States was trying to break Russia apart. This is not a good idea with a nuclear superpower, but this is the American arrogance. Well, President Putin said, no, do not come to our borders with your military. The United States regarded Putin's statements as empty because, after all, Putin represented a third-rate power and the United States was the sole superpower. And so the United States did not take seriously Russia's objections. But what happened in Ukraine was, well, what happened in Georgia, first of all, in 2008, after the NATO summit, was that the Georgian president, who was a very unstable and inexperienced person, launched a war against a breakaway region of Georgia, and Russia intervened and defeated Georgia. That was the end of Georgia's possibility of joining NATO. But Georgia had started that war actually in 2008. At the same time in Ukraine, the Ukrainian people elected a neutral government, President Viktor Yanukovych, who was a pro-Russian president who did not want Ukraine to join NATO. Because Mr. Yanukovych looked at a map and said, if we join NATO, we are going to get into trouble because Russia will oppose that. And this could lead to conflict with Russia. So Mr. Yanukovych was very realistic. The Ukrainian people also did not want to join NATO, according to the opinion surveys. But the United States did not want to be stopped. So the United States worked together with the anti-Russian forces of Western Ukraine to try to destabilize Yanukovych's government. And at the end of 2013, the United States helped to fund major protests against the Yanukovych government when the Yanukovych government attempted to delay signing an agreement with the European Union over membership eventually and over trade, because there were many outstanding issues. Ukraine wanted to slow down to negotiate this arrangement with Russia as well as with European Union. And the United States used its usual influences in the media, in the NGOs, in the political opposition to try to destabilize the Ukrainian government. This is a typical U.S. operation. The U.S. has destabilized dozens of governments around the world. It has intervened deeply in Japanese politics. It's intervened deeply in politics in almost every country. And it intervened in Ukraine at the end of 2013 and early 2014. In February, the United States acted behind the scenes, but with a lot of money and a lot of political power, to overthrow the the government of Yanukovych. From Russia's point of view, this was a U.S.-led coup. I think this is an accurate description of what happened. Of course, the U.S. government denies this. But remember, if you are engaged in covert regime change, you deny the obvious. I happen to know a lot about these events. I saw some of it in person. The United States conspired to overthrow the government of Viktor Yanukovych. That's when the war in Ukraine began. So we should understand the war in Ukraine as starting in February 2014, and it resulted at the deepest level from the U.S. push of NATO enlargement. And it was exacerbated by the U.S. coup, or the U.S.-led coup, or the U.S.-supported coup in February 2014. The U.S. says that the war in Ukraine was caused by President Putin. This is false. The war in Ukraine was caused by the United States because it could not accept a neutral Ukraine. Or, let me put it differently, it didn't want to accept a neutral Ukraine. It thought that the United States is so powerful that it can bring Ukraine into the U.S. orbit and that Russia could do nothing about it. Incidentally, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the U.S. military and security strategist of the 1980s and early 2000s, wrote a book in 1997 describing the U.S. strategy of NATO enlargement. And he argues at length in 1997 that Russia could not resist the U.S. expansionism. And that's the basis on which the U.S. proceeded, thinking it would simply be able to determine the outcome. But of course, this was arrogant, not realistic. After the coup, two provinces of ethnic Russians broke away from the regime, the new regime. These are the eastern provinces of Lugansk and Donetsk, the so-called Donbass region. They declared independence because they opposed the new regime, which was anti-Russian. And Russia negotiated a treaty with Ukraine and with these breakaway regions called the Minsk II Agreement, which was supported in the UN Security Council. And it said that the ethnic Russian regions would gain political autonomy, not separation from Ukraine, but autonomy. Now, this was backed by the UN Security Council, but the United States and Ukraine decided not to implement this agreement. They said that the U.S. said to the Ukrainian government, there is no reason for you to follow this agreement, even though it is the international law. Just ignore it. And so instead, the U.S. built up the Ukrainian army between 2015 and 2021 to an army of 900,000 people, the largest army in Europe at the time. And Russia watched all of this with growing alarm. At the end of 2021, President Putin urged President Biden to stop NATO enlargement. And President Putin put on the table a draft agreement between Russia and the United States based on the end of NATO enlargement. President Biden refused to negotiate with President Putin on this. And that was the last chance to avoid the escalation, which began in February 2022. I hope you can see, ladies and gentlemen, by this narrative that the story that this was an unprovoked war by Putin starting in 2022 is simply a lie. This is a story that goes back to the early 1990s, and it is based on U.S. expansionism, not Russian expansionism. But this is the kind of propaganda that we have in the Western media and in the U.S. government narrative. So that's how the war started. Now, what was the purpose of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022? Was it to conquer Ukraine? No. It was only 50 to 100,000 troops. It was not to conquer Ukraine. The goal was to force Ukraine to accept neutrality. And within about a month of the so-called special military operation, President Zelensky said that Ukraine would accept neutrality. And on that basis, there were negotiations in Istanbul in March and April 2022 to end the war. And they were reaching a success. But then in April 2022, when the two sides had neared an agreement, the United States and the United Kingdom told President Zelensky, do not sign that agreement. You should fight on. You should continue your war against Russia, because our aim is to weaken Russia, and you don't have to accept neutrality. And so the United States condemned Ukraine to 3 more years of war, during which time Ukraine has lost more than 1 million young people to death or to grave injury on the battlefield. Of course, the United States does not tell the truth about anything that I just said. It says that this is all President Putin's fault. But this is a standard approach of the U.S. government. And many, many people now understand the true story. The goal all along has been U.S. domination, and Russia has resisted. Now, just to bring us up to the present, the aim of President Putin has been to get the United States and Ukraine to accept neutrality rather than NATO. President Trump now accepts this reality. But ironically, Zelensky, who rules by martial law and by personal decree, and his European backers, especially the British, the French, and the Germans, do not accept neutrality. This is why the war continues. The Europeans are very cynical. They are content for the war to continue as long as it is Ukrainians who are doing the dying. And Ukraine is being destroyed step by step at the hands of its supposed friends, because the Europeans want to keep Russia weakened, and they want Ukrainians to die for that purpose. They don't want them to die, but they're content for the Ukrainians to die for that purpose. What they are not willing to do is engage in honest diplomacy with Russia, which is how this war should be ended. Let me stop there on Ukraine and turn to Gaza. The war in Gaza is also a long story. It's a long story of Western domination over the Arab people in the Middle East. It goes back at least to 1918, to the Versailles Treaty, because when World War I ended, Britain and France became the imperial powers in the Middle East to replace the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which was defeated in World War I. The British were very cynical very cynical imperial power. I would say most of the problems in the world today have British roots to them, because the British Empire made a lot of damage, also in Asia, by the way, in the Middle East, in Africa, and this is because Britain was the dominant power of the 19th century, like the United States was after World War II, and Britain made a lot of damage. In the Middle East, Britain took control over a lot of the Ottoman lands, including the province of Palestine, which was a part of the Ottoman Empire. And starting with the Versailles Treaty, Britain had a mandate, so-called, under the new League of Nations, to control Palestine. And in that context, Britain established a so-called homeland for Jews to migrate to Palestine. At the time, the Jews were a tiny proportion of the population, maybe 3% or maybe 5%, and the Arabs were 85% Muslim Arabs. But Britain began a process of bringing in Jews, especially from the Soviet Union or from Russia and from Eastern Europe. And this created conflict between the established Arab population and the incoming Jewish population. So the roots of the war in the Middle East started already 100 years ago. The Arab people said, this is our land. The Jewish people said, no, this is our ancient land. And two peoples fought over this land. The basic approach of the so-called Zionist movement, which was a Jewish and Christian movement, was to dominate the Arab peoples with a Jewish state. And this emerged after World War II with the state of Israel. It was also justified by the European destruction of Jews under Hitler in World War II, in the Holocaust. But from the Arab point of view, that was not their doing. And so the Arabs rejected the idea that the European powers and the United States should create a new Jewish state in what was land controlled for centuries by Arab Palestinian people. And Israel got its independence in 1948 when it declared unilateral independence and defeated Arab nations that objected to its unilateral declaration of independence. There's a very long story which we don't have time to consider at length. But just to say, the Zionist movement, which was the movement to create a state of Israel, always had the objective to dominate the region. And it never had the objective to share the region. And to this day, there are two peoples, Muslim Arabs and Jewish people, who have the same land or the same area, and there is only one state, the state of Israel, and the Palestinians live under the domination of that state. And that's why Israel has been called an apartheid state, like South Africa was, that one group dominates the other group. In my opinion, this is a fair description, an honest description, because the Arab Palestinian people are heavily discriminated against and abused and have no political rights because of the force of the state of Israel. So there has been since 1947, and then again after a six-day war in 1967, the call under international law for there to be two states side by side, the state of Israel and next to it the state of Palestine. The problem today is that the state of Israel refuses to allow a state of Palestine. And this is the deep problem, which is that there is no compromise on the Israeli side. All they want to do is to dominate. They say we'll never be safe if there's a state of Palestine, even though they don't try to negotiate their safety. And they say, for many of the Israel leaders, that God gave us this land 2,500 years ago, so we don't have to compromise. And that is the view of Israel. Now, this is an extremist view, in my opinion. It leads to continued war, because 8 million Jews dominate 8 million Palestinians. And many of these leaders in Israel want to expel the Arab population, or kill the Arab population, or simply dominate the Arab population through political control and apartheid rule. In my view, it is very cruel and very, very inappropriate and against international law. Almost all the world agrees that Israel is acting illegally and very violently. But one country defends Israel, and that is the United States. The U.S. vetoed a state of Palestine when it came to a vote in the UN Security Council. It blocked Palestine's membership in the UN in 2011, and then it came up for a vote again in 2024. And there was a vote of 12 in favor of the UN Security Council, 1 veto, the United States, and 2 abstentions. So Palestine would have become a state, but the United States blocked the state. This is the drama that's underway right now. The Israeli government rejects the idea of a state of Palestine. That rejection is illegal, and it is cruel, and it is immoral, in my view, because it means domination or murder or ethnic cleansing of expelling the people of Palestine. The only just solution is 2 states living side by side. More than 180 countries out of the 193 in the United Nations support the 2-state solution. The United States is the only obstacle, in my opinion, to implementing the 2-state solution. Of course, Israel objects, but it could not stop the rest of the world from admitting Palestine as the 194th UN member state, because Israel has no veto. But the United States does have a veto, and it uses that veto to defend Israel's apartheid rule. So this is why this war continues and it's so violent, the lack of compromise. Let me finally turn to the question briefly of Japan and East Asia. Well, of course, you know the situation very well, so I don't have to talk about the history from 1945 onward. But the United States originally in 1945 occupied Japan after Japan's defeat in World War II, and then it defended Japan against the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union ended in 1991, and the threat definitely diminished or was eliminated. Of course, Russia and Japan had some minor territorial disagreements. They are minor, but they are real. But they are not a cause of war, and they are not a threat to Japan's security. What has changed, of course, is the rise of China. The rise of China is the real factor at play in East Asia during the last 25 years. China did what Japan accomplished. Japan first industrialized starting in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration, and Japan became the first industrial power of East Asia already in the 1880s. We know that China lagged behind, and China, instead of the kind of remarkable transformation that Japan achieved, instead fell into turmoil in the first decades of the 20th century. That turmoil was due to revolution, it was due to Japan's invasion of China, it was due to many factors, but China did not have the kind of smooth economic, or not smooth, but the rapid, impressive economic development that Japan accomplished during the Meiji Restoration and onward. Well, after 1945, after Japan's defeat, China, of course, was an impoverished country, and between 1945 and 1949, it had a civil war, which, of course, the Communist Party won and established the People's Republic of China in 1949. And between 1949 and 1979, China had a lot of turmoil. It had the Maoist period of Soviet-style economy in the 1950s. It had the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. And it was only in 1978, with the coming to power of Deng Xiaoping, that China began the kind of rapid economic growth that Japan had invented. And Japan has done it twice. First, from 1868, in the Meiji Restoration, and then second after World War II, from 1955 onward, with the so-called decade of income doubling, the Ikeda period, the very rapid growth. Japan showed the world how to grow at very, very fast rates. And Japan's model became the model for Taiwan, for Korea, for Hong Kong, for Singapore, and starting around 1978 for mainland China. And so Japan showed the way how to achieve rapid growth. Japan should take some pride in watching China's rapid development because it is based institutionally on a lot of the ideas that Japan developed and demonstrated over the period from 1868 onward. China has now become the world's largest economy, measured in international prices. Here is the basic question for Japan. Is China an enemy of Japan? In my view, the answer is surely no. China has never been an enemy of Japan. Japan has been an enemy of China at various times, but China has never attacked Japan, actually, which is very interesting. For 2,000 years, I don't think there is a single instance of China attacking Japan. And I think this is worth us reflecting on quite seriously. There are two invasions of Japan attempted that came from China, but these were not Chinese invasions, these were Mongol invasions in the year 1274 and in the year 1281. And on both of these occasions, the kamikaze wind saved Japan. The great kamikaze wind, the typhoons of 1274, 1281, and the coastal defenses of Japan saved Japan from the Mongol invasions. But these were not invasions by China. After 1281, China never again attempted to invade Japan. This is very impressive and very interesting history. Never, for centuries and centuries, did China try to invade Japan, even though China was the dominant power. It was technologically dominant, it was demographically dominant, it was economically and militarily dominant, but it never tried to invade Japan. Actually, in 1592, Japan once again tried to invade, or Japan tried to invade China. This, of course, was Hideyoshi Toyotomi in 1592 when he was Kampaku, and he tried to invade China by first invading Korea in 1592. That failed. And then in 1597 he tried again, and that failed. And in 1598 Hideyoshi died. And that was the end of Japan's attempt to invade China. But after that, during the Ming and the Qing dynasties, China never tried to invade Japan. The next battle between the two countries was 1894, and that was Japan invading China, not the other way around. This is when Japan occupied Korea, and then the Sino-Japanese War took place, and Japan became the imperial owner of both Taiwan and Korea in 1895. So this, again, was not China threatening Japan. It was the other way around. In the early 20th century, Japan, of course, invaded China several times, including Manchukuo and then the mainland of China in the 1930s. I mention all of this because the long history of China and Japan is actually peaceful, except for short periods which were not China's threats to Japan. And I believe that China and Japan are natural friends and allies. This is my own view. Of course, this is quite unpopular in the United States, and it's quite unpopular in Japan's political leadership right now, which says we need the United States to defend us against China. I think this is a big mistake. In my view, if China, Japan, and Korea got together peacefully and said, we have no problems with each other. We have a shared cultural heritage. We have 2,000 years of history together. We are not enemies of each other. We're all facing common problems, and we are all highly innovative economies. The three countries together would form the most powerful economic grouping in the whole world and could provide solutions not only for the people of Northeast Asia, but for the whole world. Imagine if China, Japan, and Korea were cooperating with each other. The robotics, the artificial intelligence, the solutions for aging population, the cleaning of the economy, the greening of the economy, the digital revolution. This would be the natural way for Northeast Asia to develop. Of course, the United States is against it, strangely. Why? Because what's the role of the United States if China, Japan, and Korea cooperate with each other? Then the United States isn't needed. And in fact, without question, China, Japan, and Korea would outcompete the United States. So the United States does not want that to happen. But I believe that this is the right approach. I don't think Japan needs the United States to defend itself against China. Nor do I think that the United States really provides security for Japan. The presence of the United States is more likely to lead to war than it is to lead to peace. Of course, there are important issues like Taiwan. In my opinion, the biggest risk to Taiwan is not China, but the United States. Because if the United States continues to arm Taiwan, and then someday Taiwan declares independence, there will be war, even terrible war. So the main thing we should be doing is saying to Taiwan that do not declare independence, and the main thing we should be saying to China is do not take military action against Taiwan. And the main thing we should be saying to the United States is do not arm Taiwan, because that's a provocation, just like arming Ukraine was a provocation. So if the major powers would step back from each other, Taiwan could live in peace. Not independence, but peace. And this is the right strategy for Northeast Asia. Peace, tolerance, and avoiding any kind of military conflict. And in my view, the United States is not a help to that. It is a danger to that, actually. So this is just a brief thought that I'd like to put on the table. I know it's not the mainstream idea. It is somewhat controversial. But I'm a big believer in peace in East Asia. I know that from 1368 until 1839, 1368 being the beginning of the Ming Dynasty in China, 1839 being the arrival of the British in the First Opium War. Between 1368 and 1839 there was essentially no war in East Asia. As long as the Western world was outside, East Asia was able to live in harmony, with almost no exceptions, only with the exception of Hideyoshi, who was a little bit not very smart in attempting to conquer China. But other than that, you live in a peaceful regime, a peaceful region of the world, and it could remain peaceful, and that's what I would recommend. So thank you very, very much for letting me share these thoughts with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, for your wonderful, informative, and comprehensive lecture. Especially there is the important consideration of the Soviet Union and Russia, not as an enemy, but it means to make diplomatic discussion with Russia. It is important consideration for Japanese diplomacy either. Israel and Palestine also have very severe historical problems. In Asia, Japan was much more aggressive to East Asian continent than China. The history of peaceful collaboration among China, Japan, and Korea are more important. And behind of all of them, there is a U.S. global policy. Perhaps there is many questions and comments from the floor. We have a question and answer session about 30 minutes. The time is very limited, so if you have any questions, please raise your hand first. Okay, thank you. We'd like to gather all questions first, and Professor Sachs will answer all of the questions. Is it all right?
That's fine with me.
Thank you very much. So please inform your name and affiliation at first, and explain any question and briefly as possible. Thank you very much. So first, diplomat Professor Togo. Thank you.
Professor Haba, thank you very much. Mr. Sachs, Professor Sachs, are you watching us?
I'm not hearing very well, so...
Oh, you are not hearing very well. Can you hear me?
Yeah, but with a lot of echo, so maybe Professor Haba will repeat the question afterwards also. Oh, there, that's better. Now that's better. Nice to see you. I don't like to talk to this with a screen. Yes.
Is it possible to hear?
Yes, now I hear. Yes. Good. Well, Professor Sachs, it's such an honor and pleasure to meet with you through this Zoom debate. I'm a former diplomat in Japanese law firm. I retired in 2002, and since then moved to academia. In law firm, my data expertise has been Russia. After developing my developing my interest in East Asia, naturally I kept my interest in Russia. And so my major concern now is how to end this useless war as soon as possible. I was really tremendously impressed by your speech on February 21st at the European Parliament. You have described so eloquently what I have been thinking in this war, and on what should diplomacy do in such a situation. Well, exactly 1 month passed from your historic speech in your Parliament. I don't wonder, has the situation improved the past months, bringing us closer to peace? And my answer is yes and no. Yes. Because the best news is that finally
Russia and Ukraine began talk on May 16th as a continuation of Istanbul 2020 negotiations. Putin precisely lifted strongly supported by Trump. It is the classic way here after Trump Putin telephone debate in the 90s, and it is further continuing. No, European organs of UK, Germany, Poland, plus Zelensky are adamantly resisting to this rule. They insist that these talks were failed under the context that Putin will not agree on the immediate one-month ceasefire. So, as early as the 20th, European organs decided to implement European sanctions against Russia. So, I have three questions. First about Putin. Do you think that the protocol he insists to revolt is fundamentally reasonable as a basis to end the war? I think so, but what do you think? Second, about Trump. Do you think he has been so far as a reasonable mediator? He has succeeded in changing the paradigm of US policy from Biden's totally one-sided neo-Gothic diplomacy to a multi-lateral policy taking into account positions of two sides. MAGA diplomacy stands at the opposite end of neo-Gothic diplomacy. Am I right? And lastly, about diplomacy, I really do not understand. Particularly the four guard leaders. Why are they so obstinately against Russia? Is it because of genuine fear against Russia? Putin's image similar to Hitler? Or just Russophobia? Or it emanates from British geopolitical rivalry against Russia dating from the 19th century? Thank you very much, Dr. Sachs.
Thank you very much, and Professor Togo. You gave very difficult questions. Professor Jeffrey, may I have another question? Is it okay?
Sure, okay, but that's a wonderful question that Dr. Kogo just asked, so I'm looking forward to answering that. But let's continue with another question or two.
Okay, thank you very much. So is there another question?
Hello, Professor Sachs. Thank you very much for your really valuable speech, and I appreciate this great opportunity provided by Professor羽my name is Insika from Japan. I was elected from Nagasaki, and my parents survived from the bomb in 1945, and therefore, naturally, I'm so committed for the abolition of the nuclear weapon. I'll come to it later, but I need to say that we are so impressed with your opinions these days. I've watched interviews with Tucker Carlson and your book club interviews, and wonderful speech at the New Parliament was already mentioned. And I've been contacting with your wonderful partner, Sonia, regarding this issue of free zone. Now, my question is, how did you put it about Japan? You said Japan has a loyal subsidiary of the United States, and I think I wish your the advisor from my Prime Minister Ishida this movement of very important juncture of the Japanese foreign policy choices. the recent poll of the Japanese people says that about 50% of the voters are saying that we are doubtful about U.S. protection of the conflict, especially we are doubtful of the nuclear weapon deterrence. And my question was that if Germany was seeking the neutrality, I understand, however, they were not allowed to be a neutral country. And the biggest chance was 1989 till 1981, the building fell. And now this dividing line is called the German Green Belt, which is wonderful. And we are looking into Korean Green Belt, which is practically over for now representing the Cold War against the U.S. China, with U.S.-China conflict in the background. What do you think of creating Korean Green Belt at this moment? Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Inuzuka. He is the second generation of Nagasaki atomic bomb, and also the second generation of Hiroshima atomic bomb. So his question is also very important for Japanese people. So the next question will be the Direct Representative, Mr. and Professor Tahara. Please.
most of the U.S. military is in Okinawa. Almost 7% of military bases are in Okinawa. So, じゃあこれからちょっと日本語で言うんですけども、yesterday and also about 2 or 3 times in the session of Defense, Government and Defense Committee, I introduced your lecture in Europe. So, これからちょっと質問しますね。沖縄の基地を今のサックスさんのお話では、東アジアの平和を作るためには、沖縄のすごくキーストーンというかね、大事なピースのキーストーンと思います。で、中国との友好の歴史はとても長いこの沖縄です。特別な関係がありました。もちろん台湾もですね、ずっと前から同じようなグローバル化をしていました。小琉球が台湾と大琉球が沖縄だったということですね。それと、日本の間もですね、貿易がありましたよね。そういうことで小さな沖縄地域が歴史的には東アジアをですね、ずっとつないでいたというのがありますので、今、米軍基地だけこれだけ収集してると、実にもったいないんです。他の使い方がいっぱいあるはずなんです。それをね、やっぱり日本政府はもったいないと思ってないんです。きちんとしていくということが重要だと思ってるんですね。で、今、いろんなミサイルを配布してますけれども、ぜひですね、これを撤去したい。特に沖縄の日本政府にもダメなので、アメリカ政府にもうこの10年、20年言ってます、毎回ですね。それもあまり価値があるからで、今度は国連に行ってそれをやりたいと思ってますので、今日のサックスさんですね、お話、本当にウクライナの問題がありましたけれども、国連に行くことがとても大事じゃないかなと思っています。ただ
年後に参議院でロシアのウクライナ当時は侵略と言ってますけれども、侵略を決議、合意する決議、非難する決議というのがありました。私はただ一人、一番最前席に座ってますけれども、経験をしました。立ち上がって出てきました。それから出てくる間が大変でした。非国民とかね、生活とか、どんどん言われながら、そこから一緒に出てきました。もちろん私は出席にはなっています。大体でもちょっとできませんでしたけども、決定という形で、ですから、これが実は今日の沖縄のものとつながってくるということ、ミサイル配備は、あるいは避難計画は、そして台湾有事という言葉は、その日本のですね、ウクライナ国会のですね、このウクライナ戦争からこのたった2022年の1年間の間にミサイルの被害もどんどん配備されて必要なくなったということがあります。それ本当にこのウクライナの問題を明日の東アフリカと日本政府が言っているので、それをですね、どうやって防いでいくかということで、もしよかったら答えをですね、いただきたいと思います。
Thank you very much, Professor Takala, and his representative for Council. Thank you very much.
I was not hearing information. Yeah.
Professor Haba, you had to let us translate, otherwise Professor Assad can understand what the Council just mentioned. Okay. So let me translate every time. Okay, please. So there was a question about the bases concentration in Okinawa, and this is for the peace in East Asian region. And you mentioned a long friendly relationship between Japan and China, and Okinawa has in terms of very special relationship with the country, of course, Taiwan as well. While Okinawa is called Big Ryukyu, Taiwan has been referred as Small Ryukyu, so they are very familiar elements. And we also have trading relationships. So the small Ryukyu, Taiwan, has been the bridge in the East Asian region. So now, I think that the use of Okinawa as only as the basis for the US basis it's not effective. And this is not acknowledged by the Japanese government, because for the Japanese government, the presence of the US basis is very important. But on the other hand, we have to think about the situation in Okinawa, and the Japanese government could not understand our views, so we talked to the US government, and we've been speaking with them for about 20 years, but it's no way that it cannot help us as a matter of fact. So now, what we have to do is to talk to the United Nations. They also talked about the problem with Uplan. So I believe that the talk to the United Nations is really important. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine and at the Japanese Upper House, the members condemned the invasion of Russia. And at the time, I was the only one who abstained from the voting. And I was harshly criticized for the movement. I was there, but I didn't vote. So now, the Minister has been required to Okinawa region, and only after this, the upper house resolution about Uplan. So, I really believe that we are concerned that the Ukraine situation would be maybe a possible future of East Asia tomorrow. So, I'd like to hear your opinion about this prospect.
Great.
Okay, thank you very much. So, one more.
Yeah.
Question from Professor Thank you.
I appreciate your conclusive reaction. Thank you very much.
you.
I ask you two questions in Japanese. Okay?
Absolutely.
私は朝鮮の教授を務めていまして、当時、キム・イルソンとキム・ジョン、北朝鮮の関わり主義ですが、会ったことがあります。3ヶ月ほど、現地に登場して、当時の北朝鮮のさまざまな状況を見てきました。その関係も含めてですね、2つほどお聞きしたんですが、質問したんですが、まず最初にですね、ウクライナ情勢に対するサックス教授の見解を聞いて驚きました。というより感動しました。私は思いついたことと全く同じになったわけです。つまりならば、第二の戦争であると、トランプ新大統領は、以前から批判していましたが、サックス教授は同じようなことを言っていたので、アメリカでのコロナの戦いは以前からあったんだと感動しました。それとですね、私が聞きたいのは、サックス教授は先ほど、中国は、世界最大の経済大国になったと言われました。私も全くそれは同感です。で、それを踏まえて、これからの世界は、人生論はすでに終わり、ウクライナ戦争の当事者になりましたから、当時のウクライナ人生論の主要ほとんどが退場したわけです。つまり彼らは失敗して敗北したわけです。つまり人生論は相当権威が落ちたし、事実上それだけじゃなくなった。その意味で、これからはアメリカ、中国、ロシア、この新ビッグシリーズの時代に入っていると私は考えているのですが、その点はどうお考えでしょうか。これが第2点はですね、相当する中国との認識ですが、バイデンはそれを権威主義、専制主義、法の支配と人権に対する先制体制であると、それらの認識のもとに反中国とコミュニズムを敷いてきた。その延長線上に実はウクライナ戦争が起きたわけです。つまりここで重要なのは中国をどう認識するか、これだと思うんですね。先ほどサックス教授がこれからの話からは、今の中国、韓国、こういう関係が重要になると、全くそれは合格です。ただ、それによって重要なことは、中国が目指す社会体制をどう理解するか、そして習近平は明らかに社会主義現代化強国と言っているわけです。毛沢東時代に遡っていると批判する声もありますが、私は全くその通りだと思っています。ただ、毛沢東時代は生産力があまりにも低すぎた。それを増収兵が改革開放政策で資本主義共通経済を部分的に導入した。そしてその成果が今出てきて、中国経済は実質 GDP でア 主義を目指す体制と、いかに共存していくかは重要なポイントになると、そう考えております。それが、その中国との平和的な体制競争が、これからの世界のポイントになるのだと私は認識していますが、その点に対するサックス教授の見解をお伺いしたいと思います。Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Han. It is a very complicated and historical question, so please translate in case of being. Thank you.
Professor Han from the Korean University, and he says that he had an opportunity to meet the Kim Il-sung. And at that time, he stayed in North Korea for 3 months, and he saw the situation of the North Korea firsthand. And based on that, Professor had 2 questions. So first of all, about the first question, first he would like to mention that he was moved by hearing your opinion on the Ukraine situation, because that was exactly the same as what he has been thinking. And that means that this Ukraine and Russian conflict that we are witnessing at the moment is a violence war, just like President Trump has been criticizing. And hearing the fact that Professor Sachs has strengthened the same opinion, so let me feel that still in the United States there are some people who are sharing the same view as me, and that was very nice news to know. And China, you mentioned that is the largest economic superpower in the world, and I totally agree with that. So going forward, thinking about how this war is going to evolve, I suppose that the G7's reputation has been tarnished, because they were the kind of the players who were engaged in the Ukraine conflict firsthand, and the fact that this war has not ended is the failure of all the G7 leaders. And that is the reason why all those leaders who decided to go into this Ukraine war are retired at the moment. So I believe going forward, the G7's reputation will fall, and there will no longer have a need of having a G7 forum in place. So if that is the case, then I suppose that what is going to happen afterwards will be the new big 3 countries emerge, US, China, and Russia. So that is my view, but what is your opinion on that? This is my first question. And the second question is about how to assess or see China as a socialist regime. So if with the statement, I think that although the Biden sort of colors China as an authoritarian regime, with the violation of the rule of law and humanitarian rights. And based on this assumption that the United States or the Biden administration has been forming this like-minded group of countries who tries to encircle China. And I think that this kind of movement by the United States is bringing on this Ukraine war. So my question is, how do you see this in China going forward? So you mentioned that the Japan, China, and South Korea relationship, all the collaboration is going to be very important going forward, and I totally agree with that. But I think some of the people may sort of have some concern that China is a socialist country, and people may be criticizing all that. And some people may say that the current China is a kind of the repetition of the Mao Zedong era. But I think that there is a difference between 2 eras, because in the past, the productivity of China was low, but it is not the case right now, thanks to this opening strategy provided by Deng Xiaoping. And I think that his effort is very great nowadays. And in terms of the GDP, China's economy is already surpassing that of the United States, and in terms of the nominal GDP, probably China will overtake the United States in a number of few years in the future. So I think thinking about the more going forward is going to be extremely important. How can we coexist with the socialist China? So that's my thing. What's your take on this?
Sorry, so many questions for you. Is it possible to answer about that?
Yes. Well, let me thank everybody for very, very rich questions. I cannot give justice to the depth of these questions. I apologize, our time is short, but I'll make some quick remarks if I might. First, with Ambassador Togo. He asked me three questions. Is Putin's analysis of the root causes of the Ukraine war reasonable? The answer is yes. President Putin is accurate in how he describes the root causes of this war. Second, is Trump's reaction accurate and reasonable? And the answer is yes. President Trump is trying to do the right thing. He wants to extricate the United States from the war, and he understands that NATO should not enlarge, and that on that basis there can be peace. Third question, why is the Europe so obstinate? And this is a puzzle for everybody. Every day I have that discussion with people all over Europe. There are several answers. The most general answer is a kind of Russophobia and the belief that if Ukraine keeps fighting, even if Ukraine is doing the dying, somehow this helps Europe. This is a big mistake. The European leaders are wrong and self-destructive. If you ask me where that Russophobia comes from, the two main Russophobic countries are Britain and Poland. Poland, because of its history with Russia, although we should remember that Poland invaded Russia as well as Russia invaded Poland. But that is neighbors that have a long history. Britain actually is probably the most warlike of all of the countries. This is because of the British imperial dominance for nearly 200 years. Britain almost always has liked war in the last 200 years. It made war on China. It made war everywhere almost in the world. And Britain is very Russophobic, but not for any legitimate reason. So I tend to discount British Russophobia. In fact, if the United States stops its military support for Ukraine, there will have to be peace. Otherwise, Russia will simply defeat Ukraine. So I believe that we are heading towards peace. Japan could play a very useful role in this, in the G7, to call for peace on the basis of what President Trump is trying to do. Japan certainly should not be taken in by the British, the French, and so forth. And also, by the way, Canada, very strangely, has a strong, aggressive Ukrainian minority. This has roots after World War II. It's a long story. But Canada, which normally is rather peaceful, has a very strong pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia view. And Canada is the host of the G7. I would urge Japan to align with President Trump in calling for peace in Ukraine on the basis of neutrality of Ukraine. This is the bottom line. And this can happen. And President Putin will stop the war based on neutrality and, of course, other issues being resolved, but there is the basis for a reasonable peace. And Ambassador Togo, I agree with every word you said on your interpretation of this. Senator Inuzuka, thank you very, very much, and what an honor it is to meet you. Your question is about finding a green belt zone for peace in Korea. And I would say, yes, this is possible. But I would say that your question and Representative Tahaka's question about Okinawa and Professor Rittenhouse's question about China are all related. What is needed is regional security arrangements, not U.S. security arrangements, but actually Japan, Korea, China, North Korea, and Russia actually discussing with each other. Now, of course, I don't want to say this is simple, but the fact of the matter is all 5 Northeast Asian powers, the Republic of Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Russia, China, Japan, all have an incentive for peace in Northeast Asia. And the United States has the incentive for division, not peace, division. Because the U.S. wants to keep its dominance over Japan and Korea, or it wants to keep Japan and Korea in a subservient role. It wants to surround China. This is not an approach for peace. At best, it is an approach for deterrence, but not a very successful one. It's a high risk of war, the way that the U.S. proceeds, especially vis-a-vis Taiwan. So I would urge direct diplomacy of the countries of Northeast Asia. What would be an effective collective security arrangement? How to address the mutual concerns of the different countries of the region. How to say to China, you are the biggest, you are the most powerful. How can we be safe in your presence? And China can answer that question when he can give his response. Let the foreign minister explain the perspective. Discuss how this can be best accomplished. What can be demilitarized? How solutions can be achieved on a collective security basis? How hotspots can be reduced in tension so that the approach is a peaceful approach. I firmly believe this is possible. There's another interesting grouping for the region, and that is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the 10 countries that include China, Japan, Korea, and the 10 ASEAN countries. This is also, and Australia and New Zealand, excuse me. So it's 15 countries in RCEP. This is also a very useful diplomatic group. My basic belief is that neighbors should talk with each other. Neighbors should deal with each other. Because outside powers like the United States don't understand the region and try to meddle in the region and try to keep their advantage in the region through division, not through unity. If there is peace of Japan and China, the United States says, oh, we lose our foothold in Asia. We can't dictate terms anymore. And so the United States wants to play the game of protector, but maybe it's not needed in this game. Maybe peace can be achieved by the countries themselves, and I firmly believe that, also based, as I said, on 2,000 years of history, and especially on 500 years of history before the British showed up in 1839. I have a theory that most of today's problems in the world originate with the British because they were the imperial meddlers. And we should stop the imperial meddling at this stage. So this is what I would really recommend. It's very important now to try this approach because the United States is actually ready to spend trillions of dollars on new nuclear arms. This is very dangerous, militarizing space, adding artificial intelligence to nuclear weapons, terribly dangerous things. But maybe if there's peace in the region, then it's possible to say to the United States and to Russia and to China, don't do that. We don't need another generation of a nuclear arms race. We certainly cannot afford a confrontation over Taiwan. All of this, I believe, is absolutely possible and should be tried with a very, very high priority. In the final questions, is the G7 tarnished? Yes, it is. The G20 is a better instrument for global diplomacy than the G7. The G7 is too much a narrow grouping of countries led by mostly belligerent countries. This is a problem. And I don't believe, I said already many years ago the G7 should be shut down. It's not the best process that we have. Now, should it be the big three? No, not quite. What we need is in each region of the world, good diplomacy. So we need in Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, China, I should say, DPRK, Russia. 5 countries discussing with each other. They may not trust each other and like each other in every way, but diplomacy can sort out a lot. And this is what I think is important. Not to leave it to 3 big countries, although they should mutually stop a nuclear arms race, but regional cooperation is especially important. Finally, this question, can China be trusted as a socialist country? I don't think the word socialism means very much anymore, and not in the Chinese context. China is a mixed economy. It's got a major private sector, it's got a significant government sector, it's got a significant planning ministry. It's a mixed economy, market and state. By the way, it was Japan that invented that model. Japan invented MITI. In China, this is called NDRC. That's the MITI of China. Japan invented the mixed economy approach. Japan was never a pure market economy. Japan was a guided economy, and it worked very, very well. The United States stopped some of it because it was working too well. But I think METI or MITI played a very important role, and so does the Chinese government. But that's a success story. What Japan figured out is that technology is the underlying driver of progress, and government is very helpful for technological advancement. Japan invented the flying geese model of development, how to stay in the lead of technology. This is what China is doing. So you can find it very comfortable. A lot of good, familiar institutional design that shares a lot of what Japan actually pioneered. So I am not afraid of China. I think it's a success story, but it's not a frightening country. It's just a success story. If you put China and Japan together, and Korea, boy, that's a world-leading center for the world economy, for the green, digital, peaceful transformation of the world. So that's what I'm hoping to see. Thank you very much to everybody for the chance to be with you, and I hope we can continue the discussions in future weeks and months.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, for your excellent I think there are many other questions or comments, but it is a time to really wrap up. We would like to conclude with Professor Jeffrey Sachs' excellent and wonderful lecture. Thank you very much, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, for delivering such a wonderful and comprehensive lecture for the people of Japan today. I wish you the best of luck in your endeavors. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
ジェフリーサックスは出られましたけれど、まだ少し時間がありますので、お話をされたい方が、日本語で結構ですので、どうぞ。では、オンラインは じてもいかがでしょう。
はい、それではそれでは皆様ご協力を本当にありがとうございました。時間が限られていて質疑ができなかった方もいらっしゃるかと思いますけれども、非常にまとめていい答えをいただきました。皆さんの方からもしよろしかったらご意見いただきたいのですが、いかがでしょうか。組織者でもあられます和田先生に少しお話ししていただきたいと思います。
今日は、先生の話を伺う案内の文章にアメリカの要旨の人を言ったのは私なんですけど、しかし実際今アメリカの状況を見ているとサックス先生の一貫したご努力というものに対してそういうふうにお許しの適切ではないかと思います。それでウクライナ戦争を止めるという方向でトランプ大統領が出てきて、いろいろ努力なさったわけですけれども、それがやはり今の状況では少し、悩んでいるという状況に差し掛かっています。しかし東郷さんがご指摘になったようにロシアとウクライナが停戦交渉を再開したということが決定的に重要なことであって、これがなければ停戦にはいかないと思いますが、アメリカが間に立って仲介したら戦争が終わるというものではなくて、やっぱりロシアとウクライナが戦ってきたんですが、この2つの国がとにかく現実を見つめて停戦するという気持ちにならないといけない。で、朝鮮戦争の時には停戦交渉が始まりましてからそれまでに1年近くあったわけですけれども、停戦会談交渉が始まってからも実際停戦の協定調印されるまでに2年かかっています。で、3年で朝鮮戦争が終わったわけですけど、ウクライナ戦争も3年を過ぎていますからですね、これから停戦交渉が始まって、それで、まだ戦争が続いていくという状況にはならないようにするためには、やっぱり大きな努力が必要だと思います。これは世界中の人々の努力が必要だと思います。実はちょっとサックス先生に少し何か新しいこの方向を提案していただけるんじゃないかと思っておりましたが、サックス先生のおっしゃったことは、要するに日本に期待するということ、日本は働くべきだということでした。で、私もそういうふうに思っています。やはりトランプ大統領がああいうふうに言って努力をされたわけですから、アメリカの同盟国だと言っている日本の石破首相が農林大臣の首を切っているというだけでとどまらずにですね、やっぱりウクライナの停戦のために働いて、でウクライナを助けていくべきじゃないかと私は思います。それしか道がないんじゃないかと思います。ヨーロッパの問題については、もうヨーロッパの諸国は伝統的なロシアに対する反発、依頼がありました。実はこれはもう今に始まったことじゃありません。
19世紀の真ん中のクリミア戦争というのがありましたが、クリミア戦争の時にまさに起こったことはイギリスとフランスとイタリアとトルコがロシアと戦ったんです。でラストポーリ要塞が陥落しましてですね、ロシアが敗北をして、それでロシアは改革大学へ進むんですけども、その時からヨーロッパ側のロシアに対する嫌悪気合というものが非常に強かったんですね。でそういうことを当時表していた代表的な人物はカール・マルクスでした。マルクスのロシア批判というのはそういうものでした。マルクスはロシアの革命家と付き合うようになって、しっかり考えを変えていくようになりましてですね、80年代には変わるんですけども、1850年代には非常に典型的なヨーロッパのロシア由来を表している立場でした。そのことが今もある意味では続いているというか、伝統的に見てやっぱりヨーロッパから見てロシアは危険なものとか異質なもの、警戒すべきものという感じがあってですね、しかしそれは100年じゃなくて1850年からですから、なんですが200年以上です続けているという状況からヨーロッパは脱しなきゃならないと思いますね。ですからところがそれが非常に難しい。だからヨーロッパが非常に難しいので働いてもらえませんが、ヨーロッパがウクライナの戦争するのをやめるっていう気持ちにならないと、トランプに続いてですね、そういうふうにならなきゃいけないんですけど、まだそういう様子になっていない。だからウクライナはそのためにして戦争を続けなきゃならんという気持ちになっているのですよ。ですからウクライナの友であった日本がやはりもう戦争を止める時じゃないかということを働くようにしないと、このロシアとウクライナの停戦交渉うまく進まないんじゃないかというふうに思います。そういう意味で言うと、そうだということが今日は、サック先生のお話から出てきたということが我々にとって非常に重要であったというふうに思います。よろしくお願いします。
はい、ありがとうございました。サックス先生としてもこんなにたくさんのレベルの高い質問が日本側から出るとは思っていらっしゃらなかったんだと思います。ご質問に対して十分にお答えいただく時間がなかったかもしれませんけれども、本当に貴重なご質問を、たくさんの方々からいただきましてありがとうございました。サックス先生も言われましたけれども、今後も話し合いを続けていきましょうということでしたので、ぜひ2度目にも来ていただきまして、さらに議論を続けていきたいと思いますし、今和田先生がまとめてくださったように、じゃあ日本は平和を作っていくために何をするのかという、私たち自身の主体性にも疑問をされた、期待をされたということだと思いますので、今日は本当に多くの方々のご参加いただきまして、素晴らしい講演と、そして素晴らしい質問をいただきましてありがとうございました。同時通訳の方々にも本当に活躍していただきましたので、ちょっと拍手を持ってお礼を申し上げたいと思います。どうもありがとうございました。今日は本当に貴重な時間をとってご参加いただきましてありがとうございました。それではこれで会を閉じたいと思います。どうもありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。今日はお越しいただいてありがとうございます。今こそ停戦をシーソウルファイヤーな第8回、ついにウクライナ戦争を止める時が来た。これで終了とさせていただきます。皆さんのお手元にある、